As you know, I like to talk about this aspect quite a bit, and you've heard me talk about the origins of the World Economic Forum, the Limits to Growth report, and all of that stuff. So we're going to skip some of the finer details, but in 1972, the Club of Rome came out with the Limits to Growth report, which they quote-unquote predicted that society would begin to collapse by 2030. And the reason being, well, they claim that it's due to the discrepancy between resource scarcity and population growth. So, we should probably ask ourselves, were they just incredibly accurate with their timeline prediction for the breakdown of society? Or on the other hand, was it engineered to fit their transition plan? I mean, come on, based on everything they get wrong with their prediction models, I don't really think we're going out on a limb to suggest that it's pretty far-fetched to believe that this one time, miraculously, this prediction is the one time they nailed it. So, yeah, besides that, they openly talk about their blueprint for changing the world, and are following it to a T. However, to me, the real insidious aspect is the psychological manipulation that goes into this, something they are also pretty open about. It seems like they really believe this old, I don't even know what you would call it, a proverb of sorts. And I quote, "Civilizations need a myth to live," end of quote. So as a follow-up to the Limits to Growth, the Club of Rome came out with a book entitled The Final Global Revolution. This was written by Alexander King and Bertrand Schneider. And on the back of the book, it talks about the Club of Rome, and I quote, "Alexander King, one of Britain's most respected scientists, is a founding member of the Club of Rome, which includes among its members many public figures, business and industrial leaders, scientists, heads of state. Bertrand Schneider, the Club of Rome's Secretary General, is also a fellow at the World Academy of Art and Science." So yeah, these dudes are certified Illuminati, alright? I'm just kidding, by the way, don't get hung up on that. Well, I'm half kidding, okay? I'm half kidding. Anyway, my point is that in this book they lay out the plan to enable this agenda to move forward. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers are caused by human intervention. The real enemy then is humanity itself, end of quote. So, remember my point about how civilizations need a myth to live? Well, yeah, I guess they took that one real serious. Now, okay, so to understand how this all plays a role, well, the World Economic Forum began as the brainchild of the Council on Foreign Relations and Henry Kissinger. You see, Henry Kissinger was Klaus Schwab's mentor, and they met at Harvard. The first World Economic Forum meeting was back in 1971. However, it was the third meeting that really set everything in motion. Yes, the mainline speaker for that event was a man named Aurelio Pesci, another depopulationist who was also a founding member of the Club of Rome. And I quote from the World Economic Forum website, 1973, a prescient warning on the environment. So two developments distinguished the third Davos meeting. First, Aurelio Pesci, the Italian industrialist, delivered a speech on his book, The Limits to Growth, which had caused a sensation by calling into question the sustainability of global economic growth. The authors outlined the choices that society had to make to reconcile economic development and environmental constraints. And then, Klaus Schwab goes on to talk about the Davos Manifesto, which also originated from that meeting in 1973. And he talks about how they're going to update their Davos Manifesto for the 50th anniversary of the World Economic Forum. And yes, Klaus.
No one gives a shit.
And well, they shouldn't give a shit because every book this guy puts out is basically the mad ravings of a lunatic. But anyway, let's move on. The main point here is that the World Economic Forum and the Club of Rome are inextricably linked. They have been working at this 2030 plan since the 1970s. And those two entities, the World Economic Forum and the Club of Rome, well, they hold the same views on humanity. And yeah, it's not going to look good for us. I mean, yeah, they're working towards the same future. You see, the Limits to Growth set us on the path towards Agenda 21, which of course, as we know, Nancy Pelosi helped sign us on to that agreement back in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio. However, from there, Agenda 21 quickly became what is commonly known as Agenda 2030. And yeah, so these are basically just the Sustainable Development Goals from the World Economic Forum, the UN, and yeah, it's pretty much the basis for all the chaos we see today. From the Ukraine-Russia war to the global economic destabilization, the civil unrest, and yes, the rise of authoritarian governments as well. But that's not all. Yes, they can also be attributed to the rise of authoritarian thinking just within the masses. And the reason being is because they have instilled these core tenets to their ideology throughout public education. As they said, they sought a new enemy, and the enemy is humanity. I mean, come on, they openly talk about it. Okay, so one more point on this before we get back from this tangent. Environmentalism is not the problem. I don't know one person that does not want to solve pollution, protect rainforests, clean up the oceans, figure out a way to stop microplastics from pretty much destroying everything. We're all for that. But the problem is that they're using those to manipulate people, using that sentiment. Yes, I do believe. The most significant danger to our world is the power-mad sociopaths who will subjugate the world to their will. And they're going to do it all for their new economic order. Now, to any who actually do believe the narrative, I don't know what to tell you. Carbon markets and social credit scores are not going to change the climate. It's just a ruse to control you. You know, back when we were talking about the origins of the World Economic Forum and transhumanism, well, I came across a quote from a man named Arnold Toynbee. And if you don't know, this guy has ties to the origins of the modern transhumanist depopulationist agenda. He has ties to guys like Cecil Rhodes and the Tavistock Institute, I believe. He's even connected to guys like Alfred Milner and the Round Table groups. Anyway, he said, and I quote, "The cult of sovereignty has become mankind's major religion. Its God demands human sacrifice," end of quote. Now, I think that's an interesting quote because, as I interpret it, well, it's a great example of their smug disdain. And it shows, collectively, how all of these people think. Because this idea that sovereignty is something to decry, that sovereignty, either on a national level or an individual level, that sovereignty is somehow hindering human progress. I mean, it's crazy. They all have this weird collectivist worldview. Yes, they seem to believe that a centralized global authority would solve all of humanity's problems. So once again, in the quote, he mentions that sovereignty has become mankind's major religion, and its God demands sacrifice. You know, it's also pretty interesting because the core point to their entire philosophy is that human sacrifice is not only needed, but obliged for their utopian view. I mean, come on, they openly talk about how they need less people on the planet.
So in the session we just attended here at the Economic Forum, I think there was a sense of relief, actually, in your frankness. You brought up some issues that others are reluctant to bring up.
Always. All the religious groups are against me because I'm talking about population. They want more souls. I want less on the planet.
So that's what I hope for. That we can, I mean, the planet can support something like 1 billion people, maybe 2 billion, depending on how much liberty and how much material consumption you want to have. If you want more liberty and more consumption, you have to have fewer people. And conversely, you can have more people. I mean, we could even have 8 or 9 billion probably if we have a very strong dictatorship, which is smart.
And the idea that global government would stop conflict is pretty damn funny. I mean, of course, to strip the world of autonomy and force a belief system, what could go wrong? Well, that's going to lead to a hell of a lot more conflict. And most certainly, these monstrous ideologues would deem it to be a much-needed sacrifice. A sacrifice whose toll would be paid by extinguishing human life. Yes, they would say it's all for the greater good. And actually, we are seeing this happen right now as they send hundreds of thousands of people to their death in Ukraine. But you know, don't worry about it because, as they say, it's a part of the bigger picture. Anyway, at the recent 2023 World Government Summit, despite what you may think of Elon Musk, no matter what side of the drama you reside on, as for me, I am decidedly undecided on him. But I do think we should give him some credit for telling everyone that world government is a terrible, terrible idea. And he did so at the World Government Summit. So yeah, that takes some balls, don't you think?
One thing I should say, and I know this is called the World Government Summit, but I think we should be maybe a little bit concerned about actually becoming too much of a single world government. If I may say, that we want to avoid creating a civilizational risk by having, frankly, this may sound a little odd, too much cooperation between governments. If you look at, say, at history and the rise and fall of civilizations, that really all throughout history, civilizations have risen and fallen, but it hasn't meant the doom of humanity as a whole, because there've been all these separate civilizations that were separated by great distances. And so, say like while Rome was falling, Islam was rising, and so you had like the sort of caliphate doing incredibly well while Rome was doing terribly. And that actually ended up being a source of preservation of knowledge. and many scientific advancements. And so, so I think we want to be a little bit cautious about being too much of a single civilization, because if we are too much of a single civilization, then if the whole thing may collapse. I'm obviously not suggesting war or anything like that, but I think we want to be a little bit wary of actually cooperating too much. It sounds a little odd, but we want to have some amount of civilizational diversity such that if something does go wrong with some part of civilization, that the whole thing doesn't collapse, and humanity keeps moving forward.
And yes, I do think he's right on that. Global government would destabilize the world to complete civilization collapse.